Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 4 at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video takes us to Kansas Speedway, a track that I really enjoy because the fast line is right up by the wall the entire way around the track, and that makes for quite a bit of fun whenever you're running laps and makes things extra fun when you get in the race and the AI spread out from top to bottom because you have to look for areas where they're not whenever you reach lap traffic and need to pass. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Cup cars, Xfinity, as well as trucks. So let's get started. One of the big changes for the physics in NASCAR Heat 4 is the addition of tire wear. Now, tire wear is going to have a huge effect on the setup that you're running, so it makes sense that we need to, before we get into setup discussion, talk a little bit about the options that I use while I'm testing for these setups. So we'll start off in the options menu under the gameplay tab, and then we're going to scroll down to tire wear and fuel consumption. Normally I do this on 2x. I don't like to go any higher because I do like long green flag runs, but I understand that some of you like to go all the way up to 4x. Player tire wear rate, I like more wear. I like maximum tire wear, so I generally test on more wear and less grip under the grip fall off. So keep that in mind. If you're playing with different settings such as less wear and more grip, then that's going to change the setup that you're going to want to use in the races. So keep that in mind as we're talking about setups. What I'll try to do in each video is let you know the particular settings because I don't go for maximum tire wear at every track, just where I feel that it is appropriate. And also keep in mind on the driving tab, there is a setting that you'll need to match up for the AI. So if you want maximum tire wear, then you need to have that on both the player car and the AI car. Or if you're going for less tire wear and more grip, then change that for the AI as well. Before we jump into the setup discussion, let's first talk a little bit about the track itself. So you can run this track right up by the wall, and in fact, that's where I run my fastest and easiest laps around this track, right up next to the wall in that high groove, both in turns 1 and 2, as well as 3 and 4. Now you can also run this track wide open or very close to it in all 3 of the top series. I generally like to lift just a little bit, maybe coming off the throttle 5 to 10% on corner entry. So I'm still in the throttle anywhere from 90 to 95% on corner entry, but it just, that little bit of lift allows the car to rotate and allows me to get the nose pointed in the right direction so that I can run the rest of the corner wide open. As far as lap times, the goal times that they give you in each of the series for practice or qualifying are pretty good indications, but I would imagine that most of you are going to have no trouble meeting or exceeding those lap times, which means, of course, you'll be starting up front, even against the maximum difficulty AI. So that'll take care of the track discussion. Now let's move into the setups. The first setup we're going to take a look at in the Cup cars is a qualifying or short run style of setup. But even though I wanted to go for more speed on this setup, I still wanted the car to be stable because you're going to be running so close to the wall that stability is going to be key as you're learning the track. And then as you get more used to the line and more used to the car, you can certainly free the car up and gain even more speed. NASCAR Heat 4, much like its predecessors, Heat 3 and 2 and so on, you can really lean on the right rear tire to find short run speed. So keep that in mind as you're running laps and looking for ways to increase the speed. Let's get started with the shock settings. The 3.5 settings that I really like to use work very well here. You can easily use much more aggressive settings, and that will speed up the transitions into and off the corners of the car, which is something that I personally really like. But the 3.5 setting works really well for the setups that I release here on the channel. Front weight and wedge both at 52%. The higher the number you use for front weight and wedge, the more tight or stable the car is going to be. The more you lower the front weight and wedge, the more it's going to allow the car to rotate more. For the front weight, the higher number will tighten the car up on corner entry. The lower the number on front weight, the more the car will want to turn or rotate on corner entry. The wedge is more designed to determine the speed of the rotation in the car. So the higher the number of wedge you're using, the tighter the car is going to be, the slower it will want to rotate. Moving on to the springs. Left front spring at 1,100 pounds, right front spring at 1,200 pounds. Now I use the maximum right front spring here because of stability. I wanted that right front spring to be stiffer so that it gave me something to lean on, particularly on corner entry, and provide that stable base to get through the corner. That's of course not to say that you can't use something like 1,200 pounds on the left front and 1,100 pounds or even 1,000 pounds on the right front. That will certainly help the car to rotate on corner entry, and it's something I've tried and works well. I simply prefer a little bit more of a stable base in the front of the car, particularly for corner entry. Moving to the rear springs, 500 pounds in the left rear, 520 in the right rear. Only 20 pounds of rear spring split here, simply because I wanted more stability in the car. If you increase the split between the left rear and the right rear, maybe using something like 500 pounds in the left rear, 550 or more in the right rear, that will certainly help the car to rotate more, particularly on corner exits. So keep that in mind. If you're having the opposite problem and the car is just too loose, then drop both of the rear springs or decrease the amount of split between the rear springs, even to the point where running the same spring in the left rear and right rear will certainly tighten up the car. Tire settings at 21 and 22 on the left side pressures, 49 and 48 or 47, somewhere in that range for the right side pressures seem to work really well. Keep in mind that you can gain more straight line speed with higher air pressures, but lower air pressures tend to get me more grip and more stability overall, so adjust accordingly to how you prefer the car. Now on the miscellaneous settings, I decided to go with max camber on both the left front and right front, and the reason was very simple. It worked. Every time I increased the camber, I kept getting faster and gaining more speed, so I decided to release this, but as we'll see in other setups later in the video, that is certainly not a requirement. And if you feel like the car is just too loose or a little bit unstable, then by all means, lower the front camber. The front sway bar at 1.315 seemed to work really well. There's plenty of opportunity to either lower that or increase the front sway bar. Increasing the front sway bar will tighten the car up overall and slow down the amount of rotation that you're going to get. So if you need more stability, increase the front sway bar. If you need the car to rotate more, then a good option is to decrease the front sway bar, and that will certainly open up the car to rotate more. Moving on to the track bar, left side at 13 inches, right side at 11 inches. And the reason for this is simply to help corner entry. The higher left side track bar really helps the car to rotate on corner entry. So if you're too loose on corner entry, then drop that left side track bar. If you're too tight, then try raising it some more. The right side track bar is used more for corner exit. So a little bit lower by a couple of inches on the right side, just to help the car to remain stable and have some good bite coming off the corner. Brake bias is really a non-issue at this track unless you get in traffic and want to use it. So anywhere from maybe 70 to around 75 seems to work fine for me. Grill tape is really a non-issue as long as you don't get the engine overheating. So anywhere 40 or 45% should work perfectly fine. Wheel lock and steering offset, 10 degrees and 0.05. I could have certainly gone up a little bit higher on the steering offset based on the camber that I'm using here, but I really didn't feel like it was necessary and it wasn't that big of a deal, so I just kept it at 0.05. Now the gear settings, there is a lot of adjustability here, particularly in the rear end ratio. So we're using 1-to-1 in the fourth gear. I have used as high as a 333 gear, and that really starts to get into some high RPMs on corner entry and gets close to redlining, depending on what speed you're running, of course. But 333 is about the highest I would use, but I've used down to a 310, and it also worked very well. Just keep in mind that as you adjust the rear end ratio, you're also going to adjust the handling of the car. The higher the number you use here for rear end ratio, the more RPMs you're going to use, and generally the looser the car will be under throttle. The lower the number you use on the rear end ratio, the lower the RPMs will be, and generally the tighter the car will be under throttle. So keep that in mind as you're making adjustments. There are all sorts of ways to adjust the car to be looser or tighter. Now let's move on to a Cup style race setup. This is a setup that I like to use when I'm running the 4X maximum tire wear and fall off settings, because it really helps to balance the car over the course of a long run and keep the right side tires as fresh as they possibly can be by the end of a run whenever you're using those aggressive tire wear and fall off settings. So we're going to see a lot of similarities between this setup and the qualifying setup, and that's simply because I wanted to keep the same feel overall in the car, but I needed to do a few things to tighten it up and save it for a long run. Specifically, we move over to the spring settings, 1,000 pounds in the left front, 1,200 pounds in the right front. That's just to tighten it up a little bit on entry, but the major adjustment on the springs is in the rear of the car. You can see here 450 and 460 in the rear, so very little rear split. And as I mentioned when we were talking about the qualifying setup, don't be afraid to try using the same spring in the left rear as well as the right rear, and that will certainly help to stabilize the car under throttle or on corner exit. Okay, everything else is very similar on the tire settings and very similar on the miscellaneous settings, with the obvious exception with the camber. Left front camber at +2, right front camber at -1.5, and that's simply to save those tires a little bit over the course of a long run. You can certainly use more camber than this or less camber than this, and the car will work perfectly fine, so it's really more of a personal preference. Track bar, very much the same. Front sway bar, very similar. You can see the brake bias here. Since this is more of a long run race setup, I wanted to increase the brake bias just a little bit in case I needed to tighten the car up if it's getting too loose over a long run. Keep in mind, whenever you're dialing in the brake bias, the brakes aren't just to slow the car down. The brakes can be used as a way to change the setup, change the feel of the car. Dragging the brake just a little bit, whether it's corner entry, corner exit, or whatever, can really help to change the handling of the car. So keep that in mind. It's not just about heavy braking to slow the car down. The rest here is pretty much the same. Same message applies. You can see I'm using the 333 gear for the rear end ratio, and that's simply because I'm going to get a lot of fall off and a lot of grip that I'm going to be losing over the course of a full run. So I wanted to keep the RPMs as high as possible without getting them too high at the beginning of the run. So that'll do it for the Cup cars. Now let's move on to Xfinity. In looking at the Xfinity car setup, it's going to look very similar to the Cup car. So what we're going to do is spend a few moments looking at some of the differences between the two. As I've mentioned in previous setup videos, the Xfinity car tends to run tighter for me than the Cup car. So the adjustments I make are generally to help loosen the car up and help the overall rotation. So with that in mind, the front weight is a little bit lower. I have had good results lowering it even more down to about 51% overall. But for the long-term stability of the car, I chose to go around 51.5. Spring settings, very similar, but you notice that I'm using much more rear spring here than in the Cup car. Again, that's to help free the car up and help it to rotate better throughout the entirety of the corner. Miscellaneous settings look very similar with the exception of the camber. Both the left front and right front camber at 3 degrees. And again, just as we talked about in the Cup cars, the amount of camber you use is really more of a personal preference based on the amount of wear you're getting and your driving style. So adjust accordingly there to increase or decrease as you see fit. The gear settings, very much the same as what we talked about in the Cup car. The higher rear end ratio will turn more RPMs and be looser under throttle. The lower rear end ratio will be tighter under throttle. So now that'll take care of the Xfinity cars. Let's move finally into the trucks. Just as with the Xfinity cars, the trucks are very similar to what we've already talked about. So we'll take a moment and point out a few things that are a little bit different. You notice the front weight is at 51% as opposed to 51.5% or 52%. And that was just to help the car to rotate a little bit more. The truck is very easy to drive at Kansas. So I started looking at getting more rotation in the truck. Same thing applies when we look at the spring settings, 550 and 580 in the rear, a little bit more rear spring split and a little bit higher springs overall, just to maintain a little bit more rotation and maintain more speed throughout the corner. Other than that, everything very much the same or similar to what we've already looked at. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 4.